Once upon a time, a Scottish minister was kidnapped by fairies. Some might have speculated that Reverend Kirk had it coming. A dedicated Gaelic scholar and folklorist, the Reverend had spent years collecting the stories of Scottish Highlanders regarding their invisible neighbors. He compiled his findings in a manuscript called The Secret Commonwealth of Elves, Fauns, and Fairies, completed in 1691. This is because the following year, the Reverend died. Reverend Kirk was known for going for these evening walks in the summer months, often wearing little more than a nightgown. On May 14, 1692, he was on one of these walks near his parsonage in Aberfoyle when he passed over a fairy mound. Suddenly, the 47-year-old collapsed, and his body was found by villagers the next morning. Why was his cause of death deemed unnatural? Well, if the stories are to be believed, then Kirk's spirit would return with a message. He was trapped in Fairy. Kirk's story is fascinating, and not just because the Secret Commonwealth would prove to be a seminal work in folklore studies, but because at this point in history, beliefs about fairies were beginning to diverge among class lines, and the urban-rural divide was becoming all the more prominent. Today we're going to be talking about one of my favorite topics to explore on the show, so welcome and join me for a trip to the Otherworld. I'm Nicole Miras, and this is Fireside Fables. The county of Perthshire in Scotland has a long legacy of fairy lore, one that stretches into the present. Famously, in the year 2005, the residents of St. Fillan's halted construction of a housing estate that threatened to destroy and remove a fairy stone. Construction was only able to move forward when new plans were drawn that left the area surrounding the stone alone. Angering the fairies is always a bad idea. Centuries before, Reverend Robert Kirk was an Episcopalian minister stationed in Perthshire, and it's thanks to his efforts that we know a great deal about the region's folklore. However, the Secret Commonwealth almost didn't come to the public's attention. As I noted earlier, Kirk died just the year after completing the manuscript, and it would have remained in manuscript form. That is, until it was discovered by the writer Sir Walter Scott in 1815. A passionate student of folklore, the Ivanhoe and Waverley author encouraged its publication. 15 years later, in his Letters on Demonology and Witchcraft, a collection of supernatural folklore, Scott recorded the local Aberfoyle legend about Kirk's mysterious death. The story goes that shortly after his death, the Reverend Kirk appeared to a local seer with a message for his cousin. "Say to Ducray, who is my cousin, that I am not dead, but a captive in fairyland, and only one chance remains for my liberation." Ducray had a child who was going to be baptized soon. Kirk's spirit said that he would appear at the christening. "If Ducray shall throw over my head the knife or dirk which he holds in his hand, I may be restored to society, but if this opportunity is neglected, I am lost forever." But Kirk would never make it out of Fairy. His cousin was so stunned by his appearance that the rescue mission was botched. The timing of the Secret Commonwealth's rediscovery, as well as Scott's Letters on Demonology, could not have been more fortuitous. Sir Walter Scott was writing in the midst of the Romantic movement. The Romantics believed that in spite of the progress of the 18th century, especially in the realm of science, reason and rationality were insufficient to explain the human condition and range of experience. They felt that a person's individual emotions and inner world were worthy of more exploration. If you've watched my video on Mary Shelley and Frankenstein, then you'll have some familiarity with Romanticism, as well as its spooky cousin, the Gothic. But for today's purposes, it's important to know that in Sir Walter Scott's time, there was a renewed public appetite for the supernatural, even if educated classes largely no longer believed in the stories that Kirk had recorded in 1691. What makes the Reverend Kirk's manuscript so interesting is not just the incredible wealth of folkloric knowledge that it conveyed, but also the fact that it was written right as that fairy class schism was just beginning to emerge. Kirk wrote The Secret Commonwealth in a time when members of the wealthier classes were starting to question the worldview that had dominated humanity for its entire existence. The notion of the enspirited world, alive with demons and ghosts and gods large and small. And where you'll really see this division come alive is during the Victorian period. Of course, this isn't across the board. If it were true, then the spiritualist movement wouldn't have had the foothold that it did. But generally, you're starting to see this divide. But we discussed this trend in another video I made a while back, how fairies were sanitized. It's in the 19th century that you see the birth of the dainty, infantilized flower fairy amongst urban people, especially those of the middle and upper classes. They saw fairies largely as a fictional amusement for children, even as beliefs in dangerous, wild nature spirits persisted in rural communities. But for a learned individual like Reverend Kirk, he was making an argument that the beliefs and the folklore of the people of his parish should be taken seriously. There's another aspect that makes Kirk's text remarkable. Here we have a Protestant minister who is writing about fairies with an anthropologist's curiosity rather than rebuking these demonic figures. This is a big deal because during the early modern period, you have both Protestant and Catholic authorities who are struggling with how to address the persistence of the fairy faith. Fairies belong to a class of creatures that the historian Francis Young calls godlings. Not quite human and not quite divine. And these creatures occupy a folkloric category that can be found across cultures and time periods, regardless of if they're monotheistic or polytheistic. And thank God for all of them, because otherwise I would run out of things to talk about. By the way, if you love folklore, then you should absolutely subscribe to Fireside Fables. Now is the moment for my tea break. I'm having turmeric and ginger today. Anyway, liking and subscribing makes a big difference because it helps YouTube to connect my channel to other curious people like you. Anyway, when we talk about the fairy faith in the early modern world, it's important to note that fairies were not being worshipped in the way that God was worshipped or that people attended church services. But particularly in rural communities across the UK and Ireland, they were respected and feared. And this meant leaving offerings of milk to appease them, perhaps relying on folk magic or charms to protect yourself, your family, your property. And as a result, fairies are the perfect example of the clash between established religious doctrine and popular expressions of faith. During the Reformation, many British Protestant leaders tried to paint fairies as either illusions cast by the devil or as the remnants of Catholic superstition. This is in spite of the fact that Catholic authorities also took issue with the fairies. Reginald Scott's 1584 work, The Discovery of Witchcraft, which was actually a passionate argument against the legitimacy of witch trials, argued that such bugs or superstitions from popular folklore, like fairies, were the product of Catholic influence. In 1590, the Anglican minister Henry Holland wrote that the fairies, the goblins, and the hags came unto the church with the rotten mist of popery. And that's popery, not potpourri. In 1603, Samuel Harsnet, who would become the Archbishop of York in 1629, claimed that the fairies were of the popish mist that had befogged the eyes of our poor people. And so a lot of the arguments made against fairies even existing, at least in the UK, were of a heavily anti-Catholic nature. But in the Secret Commonwealth, Reverend Kirk argues that the second sight, or the ability to see fairies, is not criminal, since a man can come by it unawares and without his consent. He argues that the ability to see fairies is not a gift from the devil, but a talent that you're born with. In a time when all folk magical practices were increasingly being seen as suspicious, evil, or not real at all, Kirk makes the argument that there is a distinction between good types of magic, like second sight, and bad types of magic, like necromancy. He reminds his reader, every unusual art or science is not sinful or unlawful, unless its original or principal design do make it so. Nor was God always pleased to discover even every necessary truth at once. Yet when such truths and sciences were permitted, recommended, or suggested, they were truly lawful. In other words, intent matters. Kirk also emphasizes that second sight is more common among men than women. Some of these sections are a little bit eye-roll inducing, but they are very interesting because they are a reversal of the typical stereotypes around gender and folk magic for this time period. Usually, though not always, it's women who are cast as having magical abilities or interacting with demons and fairies. Fairies actually come up in a number of Scottish witch trials, and honestly, that deserves its own episode. I mean, Isabel Gowdy. Wow. Fairies aren't angels or demons, but something in between. The common origin story that Kirk's villagers would have been familiar with was the notion that fairies were fallen angels. They weren't good enough for heaven, but not quite bad enough for hell. Kirk echoes this idea. They are said to have aristocratical rulers and laws, but no discernible religion, love, or devotion towards God, the blessed maker of all. They disappear whenever they hear his name invoked, or the name of Jesus, at which all do bow willingly or by constraint that dwell above or beneath within the earth. Nor can they act aught at that time after hearing of that sacred name. The Tavister or seer that corresponds with this kind of familiars can bring them with a spell to appear to himself or others when he pleases as readily as Endor Witch did those of her own kind. The word Tavister, I also found some pronunciations as Tavister, but I think Tavister is probably correct. If you speak Scottish Gaelic, let me know. That word is the Scottish Gaelic word for seer. Fairies, to Kirk's parishioners, were kidnappers. Seductive, beautiful, and highly dangerous. Kirk himself often refers to them as subterraneans. Though he notes their dualistic nature, he describes them as having light, changeable bodies, like those called astral, somewhat of the nature of a condensed cloud and best seen at twilight. And yet these light, airy creatures also reside under the earth in fairy mounds or hills. This subterranean quality is something that you see throughout British folklore, all throughout different eras when describing fairies or fairy-adjacent creatures. By the time the fairy emerged as a distinct entity in the British cultural conscience, which the fairy really coalesced in folklore during the late medieval period, this creature was undeniably tied to the land. Their homes may have occupied a liminal space of malleable time, but they didn't reside in another world like Narnia or Middle-earth. The Otherworld is infused in the nooks and crannies of our world. It's right up against ours. So to those with a magical worldview like Kirk's parishioners, fairies were just part of your ecosystem. And it's this inspirited landscape that held many dangers. Heaven forbid you took a wrong turn down a fairy road, or in the case of Robert Kirk, an ill-advised walk over a fairy mound. Thank you so much for watching. If you enjoyed this episode, please make sure to subscribe and maybe even share it with a friend or two. Be well, and I'll see you next time.